Hello, everyone. This is a video overview and lecture for how to create the outline for the happiness essay. I have an example of this on the screen from a student from the previous semester, and I'm just going to go through a few things here to remind you of the things that you need in your outline, and then we'll back up and go through the process of how to get to the point where you create an outline that will help you write the first draft of your paper. If we look at the outline on the screen, we see that we've got a plan for every single section in the paper, starting with the introduction, and we need to have a hook, an establishment of the background and the issue or the debate that's at the center of the paper, and a lead in to the working thesis, which does need to be stated in a full sentence. The things that you see in black, particularly as we get to Roman numeral 2, these are things that are coming from the source material. And notice that I have asked students to put the author's last name of the sources that you're using to get points, details, pieces of evidence from the articles. The things that you put in blue are your contributions to the argument, and we should see a little bit more blue than we see black, but we should see a fair amount of black because our paper should be about 60-40 in terms of the ratio of your presence to the presence of sources. 50-50 is also okay. So in this outline, keep in mind that there's probably too much black in parts relative to what you see in blue. Ideally, we should have more blue, kind of like we're seeing a bit more of that here. That's what we want throughout the whole outline. Again, the purpose of the outline is to map out your topic sentences, your points, your evidence, the counter arguments that you will address from other viewpoints or from points that other people may challenge or question about the things that you're saying in your response to that, and mapping out the overall progression of your points. So if we scroll all the way through this, you see that there is a point on every single Roman numeral. Those are meant to stand in as topic sentences. I think we have some redefined workflows for this semester that will make that a little bit more apparent. But the idea and the rationale behind this is you're creating a plan ahead of time before you draft. You're not actually writing your paper ahead of time, but you're planning out your points very much in the same way that you might plan out what you're going to say for a speech or a presentation. You may not type out the whole thing ahead of time, but you may create an outline of the key points, the topics, the anecdotes that you want to include in that speech, and you use that as a basis, for that. So the outline for a paper works very much the same way. And basically what you're doing is you're making all of the big decisions now rather than while you draft. And you can also, as part of this process, kind of correct the plan before you even get to the draft. So a good outline will generally produce a more effective draft. Doesn't mean it'll be perfect, but we'll have something that is more likely to be on point. Before we move to the next step, and just so you see here, this one's a little over 4 pages, and it does include what the student is going to use for every single source that was chosen. So this is another aspect of the outline, and one thing that differs from the Garber outline that we did for the first essay, that one's centered around your argument in relation to one source. This one is your argument synthesizing and in relation to 7 sources that you're using to help you do that. So there's a lot more moving parts. And one thing I want to highlight right here is that if we see in this one point about the relationship between expectations and being content, we see that we have 2 different sources that are listed here. The outline gives you an opportunity to make connections across sources and see which ones bring something different to the table for a given point. So in this case, we've got one TED Talk and one print source. working together in tandem with the students' synthesis and analysis of that to create a unified point, incorporating all three of those student uh, analysis plus the things that he is using from the two sources listed here. So this is a place for you to map out and figure out not only what your points are, but what pieces of evidence you're going to use from each source and what you're bringing to the table there. Again, the color coding here serves to emphasize your importance and the primacy in the points. We shouldn't really see any points where it's all black and it's just from a source. It can happen, so don't throw out something just because of that. But the point is that the argument should be driven by it's your argument, and you're using these sources to synthesize into that. It shouldn't be something that's just largely summary of a given source. So this is the end goal of what we're looking for the outline assignment. It can be tedious and time consuming, but it's not hard per se, but it does have a lot of moving parts and some patience and tenacity to complete. We do have some AI optional workflows though that may help to a great degree on this that many people may want to take advantage of. Um, I'm going to start with where I would recommend that you begin when you're thinking about creating your outline. I have a handout here that I typically give to my in-person classes, and we go through things like this, and this is something I'll also provide to online classes as well. And I call it thinking about the bones of your argument, because that's what an outline is. It's the bones of your argument. It's the points. What points you're making? What is your thesis? Got to make sure it's debatable, and you have to think through the things that you will have to do in the paper. So this little handout kind of forces you to think about those things. And so I recommend actually opening up a file or getting out a notebook and doing this by hand. Write your thesis on a piece of paper and then start listing, um, what are the general arguments against, that particular thesis, and just kind of list. You're not really necessarily writing a whole lot. You're just kind of listing things that either pop to mind or things that you know based on the research that you have done. Then you also need to think of, in relation to your thesis, what concessions do you need to make about the degree to which your claim holds true, and what other limitations are there, if any, to the claim that you have made. And I'll give you an example of this in just a minute. And then another good activity to do is to list the questions, concerns, or objections that you think that other people might raise just in relation to hearing your thesis statement. And so you just kind of list those to have those out in front of you. And then later, of course, you're going to have to think about, well, how are you going to address those questions? How are you going to address those criticisms, those concerns? How are you going to counter argue against those? And some of that will come from just your logic and your critical thinking, and other things will come from the evidence that you find and that you run across in your articles. And these things will be addressed in your body sections. Um, Probably the biggest thing, and you may wish to start with this. I kind of have this in this order just to kind of get people thinking from the get-go of, what are the objections going to be? What concessions do you need to make? But the real bones of your paper are going to be your topic sentences or your claims in support of your thesis. And I actually think it's a really good practice to, on this piece of paper that you have out, is to force yourself to write all the topic sentences that you plan on having your paper at this moment in time. That doesn't mean that they won't change or that you won't revise them, but looking at your sources, you've got to kind of think through, what are my points going to be, and write them in one sentence, not a paragraph, but write them in one sentence. And these claims, for the most part, are also going to be tiny little debatable claims also that relate to some aspect of your thesis. So pretty much every section of your paper, or most sections of your paper, are going to be, each point is an argument, a point that you're making that you have to make a case for, and all of these together will add up to advance your thesis. So I've got some guiding questions here for you to think about, as you formulate these things, and you've got to use language in your topic sentences to tie them to the subject of happiness and to tie them to the wording and the spirit of your thesis, because if not, you'll have these topic sentences that make it harder for other people to see how it relates to your thesis or how it relates to the subject of happiness. So you've got to make sure that your wording on those is pretty tight. So you list all of those points that you can, and you may wish to start with listing points first and then create them into sentences. And once you create those points or those topic sentences, well, now you're kind of laying down the bones of your sources. So now let me bounce to this next outline. And this is not an outline, by the way. This is a rough outline in progress. And I made this a while back when I was helping a student develop. She was kind of struggling with how to develop an outline for her paper. And she had a very simple but very debatable thesis that happiness is a choice. And so, using those same guiding questions that I just showed you, I wanted to ask her, what concessions will you make about the extent to which happiness is a choice? And I'm starting to list what some of those things are. Some of those things include genetic predisposition and external circumstances, right? Because we're not all born into the same circumstances. We don't have a choice in that. And sometimes, if we're born in less than ideal circumstances, or a family that is abusive or not supportive, or if we live in a country that is war torn and things like that, then it might be easy to see that, there are a lot of elements that would impact a person's happiness that are not subject to choice. So it kind of forces you to get out of the maybe an ethnocentric view of what might be true of maybe middle class Americans, and who have a lot more of their basic needs met. And but even that, we could still have a lot of variability in terms of environment that people grow up in. So you can start to see how people might start to really question or challenge the notion that happiness is a choice, or that, the extent to which, it lies in your hands. And so I'm kind of going through, and I'm helping the student, and I created this file for her, as a guide and a model, and to get her to think through these things. And I used some sources that I was familiar with to kind of help me think through it if I were writing this paper. So I asked her, will you have a what happiness is not section? And if so, what will go in it? Because she's writing an argument of definition. And so that's one of the things that you can do for that, is have a what happiness is not section. And that's all counter argument there. But if you're not writing an argument of definition, you would not have a section like this. So this would be irrelevant for probably a lot of students in this class who are not writing that. So since she's got the word choice in her thesis, in terms of identifying topics, I'm thinking of, points, and I'm using the word choosing to kind of make sure that as I'm going through this rough outline, that I'm tying into that. So I might, kind of bring up the point of choosing to be healthy. Well, there are aspects of our health that are within our choice. We can choose what to eat, we can choose the level of activity that we engage in, and so on. But then we might have a lot of things that are outside of our control. We might get sick, we might get cancer, we might be born with some kind of disability that, impacts our mental or physical health, and so on. And I know some questions that people will ask in relation to that. People might say, well, there's a lot of stuff about your health you don't have a choice about. And, what if you've got a really serious health challenge? How can you can't choose your way out of that. And if we um, think about the relationship between health and a person's ability to be happiness, many people might say it's an important component, or that, or they might concede that it's more difficult to be happy if you are facing difficult or life-threatening or debilitating health circumstances, or even if you're dealing with that with a family member. So I'm starting to think through like sources that are related to this, and I watch a lot of TED Talks and always have a lot of those in my mind. And so I'm listing some of those here, and I know that I'm going to have to counter argue to some extent against, those kind of notions, and I do have some examples of that from a couple of TED Talks, how although it's not a universal thing, that it is possible for people, even for people who are experiencing health challenges, um, to make some choices that will impact their overall emotional and mental well-being. And I'm listing those things here, and I'm listing things, so that I'll remember later when I'm creating my regular outline what to include. So I'm going to have a point on, resilience, and notice I'm still using choosing in my rough outline so that I can remind myself when I create my topic sentences that I'm using the word choice a lot, and that I'm tying these things to concepts and also to the thesis and the concept of happiness. And I'm going through here, listing sources and listing my own thoughts. Didn't really color code this when I was helping her, but this is me thinking through the bones of my paper. Again, kind of using this handout over here as a model of guiding questions, but then I'm opening up another file over here and kind of thinking up these things. If I think to do it at the time, I can actually create the topic sentences here, and then I'm just kind of like listing things that I can use from sources, and I'm also kind of listing things from me. So here I'm thinking about a point about how we can choose to find meaning or purpose in things, and going through my thought process there and listing some potential sources to use. So it's very rough, but this is the process that I follow when I'm creating an outline, especially one from scratch with no AI, kind of help or interaction. You've got to be able to know, what are your points? What are people going to object about that? What pieces of evidence are you going to use? What are you, how are you going to connect the dots, and what are you bringing to the table? So you just kind of do this in a very rough sense. Notice that you're not writing anything out. It's bullet pointed, it's listed. I find this very useful because I often make mistakes when I'm creating a rough outline, and I end up moving stuff around, taking stuff out, and things like that. And once I have this, even if it's not perfect, it really helps me create a formal outline, which, if I bounce back to that one, is the one where it's cleaned up, it's much more concise. I can see the forest for the trees, and I can also see what I'm using from the sources in a given point. And if I have notes on these things, then I'm actually later writing my draft from the outline and notes, and I'm not having to flip through, you know, 100 pages of research that I have gone through and maybe annotated and taken notes on. And I can use my notes and not have to flip through the articles, and I've got the basis of my points right here. The student in the example that you see right here also did something very smart. He wrote down the page numbers of what he needed for various sources to make it easier for him when he's drafting to find those things if he does need to flip through, or to find those places in his notes if he took some formal notes. All right, so this is the sample of this. Now I'm going to show you a couple of other things that are representative of and the student in this case also, when he was working on this one, he did the outline by hand, but he did use AI in the workflows that we established in a previous semester. He used AI, but what he found was he was kind of frustrated because he wanted an AI platform where he could load all of his sources into it so that he could use AI to help him see connections between the sources that he might miss on his own, simply because of the volume of information. And at the time, we had Claude, and if which was is it still allows you to use PDF uploads in Claude, but as we know, if you're on the free version, you're going to be really limited as to the number of sources you can use and still ask questions in a single thread. And the same is going to be true in ChatGPT. If you've got the paid versions of these, then yeah, you could upload all your sources and be able to interact with them, and ask it to make connections between sources that are likely to have connections. And so we really wanted to be able to do that, and was frustrated that the free version of Claude wouldn't be able to do that. But I will say that There are some workflows around that, and there's also the possibility of using Google Notebook LM, where you can upload many documents in there at once and do things like ask it to extrapolate connections between sources, which can help you flesh out your outline and see things that you might have missed otherwise. But it is important to know that you never want to let AI choose for you what you're using from a source, because it can't think the way that we can, and it may not always make the best choices. So don't ever let any AI workflows take over or have more influence than they should in your human creativity and agency, because humans will still generally be um, more creative and more nuanced in what they see and how they can do things, but AI can certainly leverage that. All right, so the next thing I want to show you is I want to show you a Copilot thread that I created. I'm not going to scroll through the whole thing, but I want to tell you the context and I want to show you the output that I think is going to be useful to us in creating an outline, a baseline outline that you can build on to create the outline that I'll be collecting for the before we start drafting the paper. So in this thread, I was helping a student who was a little bit behind and overwhelmed in the annotated bibliography process, and she didn't really have sources necessarily yet, was having trouble coming up with a debatable thesis. And so I met with her on Teams and spoke for a bit and kind of got insight into something that she might be interested in writing about. And we had a conversation. I made some suggestions. I gave her some sample thesis statements to consider, and kind of turned her loose to kind of work on that on her own. But then I spent the next few minutes talking with Copilot, doing some things that I had hoped would jumpstart not only her research process, but also give her a sense of what we're doing this week in terms of creating an outline that'll develop your points and things like that. And it turned out to be really useful and something that I think is going to be useful for the whole class to see. So I saved the thread and cleaned it up a little bit, and I just want to highlight the fact that a lot of what I did in the first part of the thread are the things that I showed the class to do um, week before last. So we really had about 2 weeks to do research for the happiness essay to lead into the annotated bibliography. And so the first part of what I did is, once I knew what the student wanted to write about, I wanted to use the same techniques that I had showed the class a couple weeks ago to find some sources, quickly for her to look at, um, and to consider. Not necessarily they're all going to be good, but sometimes even if you don't use a source, you can find concepts, you can find things that are useful to look up, keywords and things like that. So the conversation that I have here is about 19 interactions, and it took me about 50 minutes in total to do that. And in the span of that time, I found 21 sources, 17 of which were JSTOR articles, and 4 were TED Talks. So even though I was on the regular internet, I found 21 sources that I would be able to find in the STC databases. I mean, obviously not the TED, but I approve of the TED as the outside sources. So I found 17 articles from JSTOR, which we have those in the databases. And I actually found those probably in about 20 minutes to find those sources. The whole thread took me about 50 minutes, but it didn't take very long to find the sources. Like my first question asked me to suggest some TED Talks, and there were 4 right off the bat. Again, these are not necessarily the best or the only, but it does give me or students a starting point to look at. And when you're doing the informal research, you can use AI to break these down to vet them and kind of see which ones are really worth watching and looking into more deeply. So putting myself in the role of the student, I'm kind of asking questions and saying, can I sustain a paper on the role of grief and happiness, or do I need to broaden it? And I'm having a conversation with just Copilot. And I'm using this because it's convenient. I'm doing some preliminary research. The other language models are good for a lot of things, but sometimes when you're doing things on the fly and you're in Edge, Copilot is really good. And this is an example of one time when Copilot did a really good job, but only if it's prompted well. So I went through this whole thing and ended up coming up with, um, some ideas for thesis, some ideas for various things, and toward the end, I come up with um, a rough outline that has a pretty good structure to it. So let's see this first one. This first one was not that good because it was focusing on a thesis that was just about grief. And I had to remind Copilot, but the paper is about happiness. So it took a little iteration to get the thesis um, toward the notion of happiness. So here we go. Here's a better one. While grief is often seen as the antithesis of happiness, it can paradoxically lead to a deeper, more resilient form of happiness by fostering personal growth, strengthening social bonds, and providing profound appreciation for life's fleeting moments. Now, this is not something that necessarily the student wants to take as her own, but it serves as a starting point, and it sort of validates the idea that, hey, maybe there's something to this idea of the relationship between grief and happiness. And at least this thesis shows the relationship between the two. So this would be workable. And so it's a good starting point. So as I started asking it to create a basic outline, it started to do that from an academic standpoint. Oh, do a literature review, do a theoretical framework. That's true of what you would see in the kind of articles that you look up to research in, like JSTOR and Academic Search Complete. But that's not characteristic of the kind of paper that we write. We're writing a regular argument, if you will. And so I had to explain, oh, this is for a rhetoric class. This is for a regular outline, and I'm kind of giving it the guidelines of what it needs to include. And so it's providing, start with a hook, give the background information, present the thesis. So I like the fact that it's reminding us what goes in the outline, and then it's got ideas for the body paragraphs. Now, I don't like that it's got Roman numeral 2 body paragraphs. That should never be. These are the things that should be on the Roman numerals, but I'm going to correct that in just a moment. So you'll see that it takes me a little bit more space to do that. So it's still not doing what I want there. Takes a few more, goes to get it. And let's see, maybe here we go. So here's one that's starting to look a little bit more like ours. So hook, background information, thesis still there. First body point is one that grief can be a catalyst for personal growth and happiness. So you see there's enough wording in that particular Roman numeral 2. There's enough wording there for you to glean a topic sentence from that. But what I also liked about Copilot is that it actually put one there. Experiencing grief can ultimately lead to greater happiness by fostering significant personal growth and self-awareness. And then it's reminding us, now this is not exactly how we want to formulate it in our argument or in our outline, but it's reminding us what we need to do to develop that topic sentence. We have to provide evidence. We're going to have to think about, well, what are the counter arguments people are going to raise against this point? And keep in mind, it's just listing one. There could be others. And it also gives an idea of how you could counter that. So in this one, it says, you could maybe look for psychological studies on post-traumatic growth. So in me creating this for the student who was working on her annotated bibliography or trying to, get sources and ideas, you know, this kind of thing can be useful in letting you know, like, oh, okay, I might want to look up some stuff on post traumatic growth, which is kind of built on, we've all heard of probably post traumatic stress, but post traumatic growth is this concept that sometimes we go through something really difficult, sometimes traumatic, and it doesn't always happen, but oftentimes people discover. It may take time and a lot of work, but they may discover what is known in the literature as post-traumatic growth. So instead of it being something that is debilitating, like post-traumatic stress that interferes with, your ability to live your life. This is something that maybe helps you develop um, resilience, empathy, wisdom. It's kind of like one of the that cliche that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and it kind of builds on that idea. And Copilot brings up the point that, well, some people might argue that grief only leads to prolonged suffering, and that may be true for some people. And so it's important to know that there are limitations to the claims, but Copilot says, well, you could highlight cases where individuals have found new purpose and strength through grief, leading to a more profound sense of happiness. This kind of thing is also useful to see. There may be some students that are writing not necessarily about just the relationship between grief and happiness, but maybe the relationship between adversity or the relationship between uh, negative emotion and happiness. So maybe there you have a broader approach, but you can kind of see, this. So I think this kind of thing right here with getting it to do something like this that and if you already have your thesis, so much the better. You can feed that into not just Copilot, but any AI and say, hey, here's my thesis, this is my plan, or whatever, and get it to help suggest like some points. Keep in mind that you're going to need to reject some of these points. If you were to go back and look at this thread, it had a lot of things in there. I said, oh, we don't need this. We don't need the nature of this concept and the nature of that concept. I didn't want a lot of fluff and filler in it. And so I had to say, take that stuff out. Let's just focus on, the main claims that I might need to treat. And keep in mind that the rough outline that I'm developing here with Copilot is still going to be very incomplete because it's not counting any sources that have been chosen. I've just kind of asked it, what are some sources? And then I asked it, what are some basic points that I might be able to make, in developing this thesis, and so on. So it does this through the rest. I really like this structure and strategy. The wording here is enough that even if it didn't have the topic sentence here, the student would be able to kind of come up with one on their own. And keep in mind that you want to take those topic sentences, the ones that you like, or you're like, wow, I agree with that. You've got to make sure that you've got the research for that. And that you've also got things that you're going to be adding to the table. So this is a very basic outline, but it's super useful in you using this as a basis to build on. And so we see in this next example that shared experiences of grief can enhance happiness by strengthening social bonds and community ties. If we're lucky enough to have those strong social bonds, a lot of times when we go through something very difficult, there is an outpouring of support when that happens. And you see it kind of goes all the way through. Now, the conclusion part is not that great. Summary of key points, restate the thesis, closing thought. That's kind of canned and formulaic, and we want to do a better job on that in our outline and so on. But you get the idea here. So this is a really useful tool for you to do. And now that you already have your annotated bibliography done, you don't necessarily have to go through, all of this process that I showed in the thread here. But the part that I wanted to highlight for this week where we're creating the outline is if you create something like this where you can get it to put the points, give a topic sentence, evidence, counter argument, rebuttal, where it's not doing anything for you. And remember, this is what we always want to do when we're using AI. You want to tell it like you're acting as a writing tutor or writing coach. You're helping me think through this. Don't do anything for me. But it's helping you provide a framework here that might take you a lot longer to come up with on your own. And keep in mind too that this can also become a hybrid approach. We don't want to rely on AI to the point where, we're letting it do everything for us. But one workflow would be to have it create a baseline and use that to build on. You throw out what you don't like, you add what, it left out or what it didn't consider, and then you build on that, by adding what you're going to use from your sources, adding what you're going to use from your own critical thinking, to kind of map out the progression of the points. Again, in a phrase-based manner, not in a I'm writing it out kind of matter. Keep in mind too that when you create your formal outline, you won't have part formal outline as in Roman numeral 2 and then bullet points underneath. But when you're using AI to do something like this, it doesn't really matter because this is just useful. And so this is kind of the first part of what I want to show you in terms of how you can use this to really simplify and not take all the work out, but it can take out some of the frustration because you can kind of see more clearly from the get-go what it is your outline needs to do and what its purpose really is. I'm actually even a fan of us using this kind of thing in hours where you've got the topic, um, on the Roman numeral and a topic sentence underneath, or even just putting your topic sentence on the Roman numeral. So I think I'm okay with either one of those workflows, putting the topic sentence on, say, Roman numeral 2, or doing it like this. But let's just keep it in formal Roman numeral outline format with, the A's, the B's, the ones, the twos, like we did last time. Now, there are other workflows that I think will also be useful with this. I'm going to pause the video here right now to open up another screen so we can talk a little bit about other workflows that I think will be useful in conjunction with this in terms of creating your outline. So I'll be back in just a minute. Okay, I'm back and I'm in Google Notebook LM. If you watched one of the videos I made, I think it was last week, then you've already seen a little bit about this and what it can do. But if not, it has really great use cases potentially for working on the outline. I'm just going to click into one of my simple notebooks that I have, and this is for the quest for happiness. Now, I have already, populated this with some things, but when you first come in, it's completely blank, but it generates a summary and it's got these preset buttons that you can push to create some quick notes from it. You can have a chat with the sources, so you can interact with it. Using Google Notebook LM, you can interact with it and ask it, oh, I'm a student in a rhetoric class and I'm writing a paper. This is my thesis. And if you already know what point you're going to make, so you can interact with it to extract points and things like that. Now obviously this is not a substitute. This assumes that you have read all of the sources and that you've annotated them, maybe by hand, possibly taken notes on. I always annotate by hand and take notes on them. But then if you took notes on them and if they were on computer file, you could even load your notes into Google Notebook LM, load the sources in, and you can kind of experiment to see what works. Now, right now, I have one source in here. You can upload up to 50 sources in one document, and all this is free. I haven't run into any question limits yet, and it's unlike Claude and unlike the free version of Claude and the free version of ChatGPT, where you're going to hit limits. If you are uploading too many PDFs, you're going to run out of questions sooner. I do still think those LLMs are really well suited for doing some things that may be better than Notebook LM, but Notebook LM excels in that the things that you're interacting with are the things that you're uploading into it. So right now I have the Quest for Happiness, which is one of the articles that we explored in class through one of the hypothesis assignments. This is a really good source, by the way, for almost everybody's paper because it establishes kind of the ambiguity of being able to define it. So anybody writing an argument of definition, there is a place for this source there. Um, it's good, and students may find use for it in other cases as well. So one use case is to kind of have one notebook per source. So you can do some post-processing things now that you've read it, asking it things about what points, but you can also create other notebooks where you're putting in more than one source. And the neat thing is that when you have more than one source, you can choose which ones you want it to focus on. So let me back out of this and go to one. So here's one where I have two sources in it, and they're both related to happiness. So if I wanted to just have a conversation with this article called The Dark Side of Happiness, I can uncheck the upside of feeling down and I can ask questions about that. Or I could say, here's my thesis. Can you help me see what points I might need to make? You can ask about. Now, again, you don't want to offload all of your thinking about this, but this will help you do some things more quickly than you would be able to do on your own. And let's say I thought that these two sources might have some kind of connection, then I can ask about those kinds of things. And what that can help in, although I hope that you cultivate and develop the skill yourself. Again, my intention here, I don't want anybody to just, kind of have AI do everything. And really, I think it will end in disaster if you do, because I have found a lot of times if you let it do all the decision making, it doesn't always make the best choices, and that's true of all of the LLMs that I've seen so far. But it can do some things that are really powerful nonetheless. But if we go over here back to the student's outline, notice how in some cases, everything from, okay, in this one point right here, um, where he's got this giant section on human brain and practical terms. He's got all this. So this is going to be a multi-section, multi-paragraph thing. But you see all the different sources that are here and so on. And this student did this by himself, making these connections by himself. He didn't use AI for this, but he did use AI to help him. Uh, he had conversations with AI, which in turn helped make some of the choices that were here. But if I go back over here, and if you imagined having some notebooks where you've got just your single source, so you can, think through that and ask questions about it, especially after you've already read that, and then you start putting things together. Like maybe, for example, I know these two sources are going to go together, or likely to go together for a point I'm going to make. I can ask questions about that. I can bring in other things. So I do think it's probably valuable when you're using Google Notebook LM to have separate notebooks for each source that you're using, to have conversations with the texts alone, if you will. Although you can kind of still achieve that here by just doing this. But keep in mind, the more sources that you have in here, then the longer your thread is going to be. And, if you're taking notes and things on the articles, which the saved notes are up here, in this one I don't have any saved notes. The great thing about Google Notebook LM is I just accidentally clicked on add a note, but if I click on this, I can add notes here by hand, things that are me. So, and I could rename that my note on such and such subject. So I can jot down my notes and thoughts here. I could also, if I've taken notes on just a regular Word file, which I often do, I can upload these into the Google Notebook LM2 and interact with those and the sources. And so this can be a useful thinking tool to help you, but you're still going to have to be the one that's in control, the um, the one that's driving the bus on these things, but this can be a useful tool. Other workflows include, you can also take these sources and you can upload a source into Claude, have a conversation about that. Claude can still create basic outlines and very detailed outlines. If you remember back from Garber, I showed you with the Garber essay how to take the more basic outlines that AI are more generally likely to generate from the outset, and how you can iterate to get more detail, but you have to ask for what you want. So these are some really good workflows for you to consider using in your paper. Anything you do, though, I will ask that you save your threads. If you notice here on Google Notebook LM, we don't have an alternative way to save these, but there's a way to share like the whole notebook that you use. And so you'd click on that, and we'll have to rely on that. But don't count out Copilot, because look at what I was able to do in creating a basic outline that was really useful there. The trick is figuring out what to ask and ask it sooner, so that you don't have to iterate as much and you get more of what you want in the first go. So to that end, I will be providing, some things that I hope you find that are useful on that front. But I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up and kind of remind everybody this is what our outline will look like. But I am okay with some modifications here where we have I really did like what Copilot did in terms of, which I advocate for anyway, having phrasing on the lines that is more indicative of the topic sentences that you'll have. But I really also liked the actual topic sentences that were there. Again, don't rely on AI to do all of that for you. You should be able to formulate topic sentences on your own. But this is certainly a good way to get jump started on the process. So that's it. That's a wrap. I'll close this out so I can get this out to you. Y'all have a great day. And if you need anything, as always, please reach out.